It's been 2 years since the devastating discovery of more than 200 unmarked graves at a former residential school in Kamloops, BC. Ground-penetrating radar at the time showed more than 215 children had been buried at the site, a finding that sent shockwaves across the country and reinvigorated calls to action. Since then, hundreds of other suspected unmarked graves have been identified at former residential schools across Canada. And last June, the federal government appointed an independent interlocutor to investigate. Kimberly Murray was tasked with, among other goals, working with Indigenous communities and residential school survivors to help them search for those graves and making recommendations to strengthen laws to protect and preserve those burial sites. Murray is set to table an interim report on her progress this Friday. She joins us now. Hi, Ms. Murray. Good to see you. Thank you so much for making the time.
Nice to see you.
You're about halfway through your mandate. Your interim report is just around the corner. I was wondering at this point if there's a major takeaway you've arrived at that you could share with Canadians watching.
I would say that there's an additional areas of concern that I will be raising in my interim report that wasn't raised in our progress report that we issued last November. As I continue to meet with survivors and communities, I'm hearing more and more of issues and concerns that they're raising of the barriers that they're facing as they do the sacred work of finding the children. So we'll be addressing a number of those concerns in the interim report.
Yeah, I did want to ask you, because you have flagged throughout your appearances, for example, before the Senate and also in your progress report, that there have been some significant barriers to accessing really the breadth of documents you need in order to be able to really be able to ascertain really the sort of scope of what has occurred. Is that still central to the challenges that you face?
Yeah, access to records is probably the number one concern that we hear from communities about, the ongoing struggle that they have to get full access. Many communities are being given redacted documents or limited documents. The time to get to access to the records are taking a very long time. It can take up to 6 to 8 months for a community to get access agreements in place. So, records is a really big concern, both from the federal government, the churches, and provincial governments. There are records in all kinds of institutions across the country. There's also a number of concerns in relation to access to land. A lot of the territory that needs to be searched is owned privately, and communities aren't able to get access to those lands to do ceremonies and to do searches.
And is that kind of where what you've identified previously as legislative gaps might fit in? And by that, I mean, is there a role for the government here to intervene in some way in order for access to be granted on these private lands if the private owners are not willing to do so?
Absolutely. As you said, there's a lot of problems with our legislations that we have across the country, and there's no protection of these burial grounds. There's no legislation that gives access to First Nations communities to get on these properties to do the searches that they need to do. And absolutely, there's a role for provincial and federal governments in relation to new legislation, and that will be, the recommendations I'll be making in the final report about what that new legislation should look like.
Have you had any conversations throughout your work here with either governments at the provincial level or the federal government about doing that? I take your point, obviously, that your specific recommendations will come with your final report, but if I'm sitting here thinking about the problem and how urgent it is, I would imagine they could be able to introduce some things that could make a difference sooner than them.
Absolutely. I have met with all the provinces and territories at a federal provincial territorial meeting and raised some of these concerns that were identified in our progress report and further concerns that are in the interim report. I think that there's a lot that provinces could be doing. I speak a little bit about this in the interim report about some of the things like waiving fees for records for communities to be able to access information. So, we don't need to wait to the end of my mandate to make some changes and put some things in place.
Are there fees being applied when communities are asking for those records?
Yes, absolutely. There's freedom of information requests that communities have to do, ATIP requests. The backlog is horrific. You have to go online and do these requests, and then they have to go through access review, and then they get the redacted documents. I mean, we need to move beyond that. These records were created about Indigenous people, and Indigenous people need to have access to their own records.
And can I ask what the impact on the communities and on people who are trying to access these documents is? And I ask because they're, of course, the ones at the heart of all of this, who are having to deal with these revelations and deal with the legacy of what's happened to them. Does this make it a lot harder?
I mean, it's very frustrating. It's very upsetting to families. Families are also trying to trace children that were taken from their community to an Indian residential school to other institutions that the children were transferred to. So we have a mix of federal and provincial entities and institutions. And so it shouldn't take 50 years to find out where your child is buried. And we write about a couple of examples in our interim report that's coming out. That it's just terrible that families are having to go through this to determine what happened to their child.
I can't even imagine. We look forward to the release of your report. Thanks so much, Ms. Murray.
Thank you.